Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to you fine folks around the globe. And today things are about to get just a little bit nutty because today we uncover the reign of Amenhotep IV. Or you may know him by his, crazier name, Akhenaten. So up until this point, Egypt under the new kingdom had been steadily growing in power, influence and wealth across the centuries. From Amenhotep I's expulsion of the Hyksos peoples all the way up until the reign of Amenhotep the Magnificent, Egypt had branched out to become more extensive in its reach than ever before, now having trade relations with the likes of Mitanni, the Mycenaean Greeks, and even Babylonia in Mesopotamia. Rolling double after double, Egypt had been blessed with the leadership of several successful and skilled pharaohs, such as the likes of the Thutmosis and Hatshepsut, as well as Amenhotep III. And you may be wondering, with Akhenaten, where did it go wrong? Well, it may surprise you, but he did not start off this way. In order to figure out what made Akhenaten perhaps one of the most controversial pharaohs in Egypt's history, our story begins in 1353 BC with the death of Amenhotep III and the coronation of his son Amenhotep IV, as he was known at this time. At the beginning of his reign, Amenhotep IV ordered the construction of several new temples dedicated to the god Re-Harakte, who at this point in Egyptian history was an aspect or form of the god Horus, who was widely regarded as a cosmic deity who had been worshipped since the earliest days of Egyptian civilization. Perhaps therefore making him even more popular than the guy who always carries a pack of chewing gum with him at school. But another thing to note about this aspect of Horus is that he is depicted with a golden solar disc above his head, which could be where the painted form of Aten originates from. I mean, if you look at the two of them, they do look remarkably similar. Only, the disc of Aten has cute little hands. Moving away from the topic of cute little hands, however, it's generally agreed that Amenhotep IV's shift in religious policy from polytheism to monotheism begins roughly 5 years into his reign in 1348 BC. But the big question here is, why the sudden shift in religious policy? It's not known for sure, but there are a number of theories as to why Akhenaten did this. One of the more prominent theories is that Akhenaten performed this shift in religious policy to greatly limit the already substantial power of the cult and priesthood of Amun in Egypt. And in order to understand Akhenaten's motives a little better, we now have to delve into the more technical parts of ancient Egyptian society. In this civilization that is in some ways quite far removed from our modern civilizations, the rules of economics and welfare were quite different. But the general consensus was that if you owned a large amount of land, then generally you were seen to be wealthy. Not only that, but you also held a considerable amount of influence, not just within economics but in also the government itself. And little by little over the centuries, the cult and priesthood of Amun, perhaps one of the most popular gods in Egyptian society at this point in history, had been steadily acquiring more land, with the construction of many temples under previous pharaohs dedicated to the god Amun among various other gods. And it appears that this presented a small and not quite noticeable problem, for by the time Amenhotep IV or Akhenaten ascended to the throne of Egypt, the cult of Amun had in its possession so much land and wealth that its influence and control in the Egyptian empire was thought to be almost on par with that of the royal household, therefore able to contest even the pharaohs themselves. And in an essentially religious society, where the pharaoh was seen as an intermediary between the gods and humans, it was essential for pharaohs to maintain power over their lands. And with the cult of Amun stomping about like it owned the place, grabbing up every little last bit of spare land it could lead to potentially a major power struggle between the cult of Amun and the royal household, meaning it would be very easy for a pharaoh to be overthrown should the need arise. And therefore it is possible that Akhenaten made the moves he did through his own paranoia of losing what little leeway in power he had over the cult of Amun and therefore the rest of Egypt. And so in 1348 BC, Akhenaten outlawed Egypt's polytheistic religion, something that had existed since the Old Kingdom of Egypt, roughly 2,000 years before his reign. And with this dramatic shift in Egyptian religion came the closure of many temples across the Egyptian empire, with Akhenaten himself having proclaimed the existence of a single all-powerful deity or god, simply known as Aten, depicted as a sun disk with those adorable little hands. And Akhenaten himself being declared as the living incarnation and embodiment of Aten itself. And it's not just with religion that we see the most drastic changes that Akhenaten made to Egypt during his reign. This complete restructuring of Egyptian society stretched beyond religion to also encompass governmental and foreign affairs. Now, I've said in previous videos that at the very beginning of the New Kingdom with Ahmose I's reign, that the city of Thebes became the seat of government within Egypt and the rest of its empire. By the time Amenhotep IV or Akhenaten was crowned in 1353 BC, this was still the case. Thebes was still the governmental centre of Egypt and its empire. However, I was being serious when Akhenaten enacted a complete overhaul of Egyptian society at that point, even going so far as to construct a brand new capital city, which he named Akhetaten, or you may know it by another name, Amarna. To put this into perspective, let's say that tomorrow morning it's suddenly announced completely out of the blue that London, as one of the capital cities of the United Kingdom, is suddenly going to be disregarded as a major city, and that the British government was going to build a brand new city somewhere completely different within the country itself. Not only would this be completely crazy, but this would cause a considerable amount of political and administrative upheaval. So you can probably imagine how this suddenly felt to the ancient Egyptians when Akhenaten suddenly declared that Thebes was no longer the capital of Egypt and that a brand new city in its entirety was going to be built, and it was going to be named in a similar fashion to the name that the pharaoh had chosen for himself. Probably not the best way to explain that, but the point I'm trying to get across here is that the things that Akhenaten had done so far was crazy in the grand scheme of things when it came to ancient Egypt itself. I mean, if you were to compare Akhenaten's reign and his deeds to that of previous pharaohs, he makes every pharaoh before him by comparison look completely tame. And I haven't even started on the craziness with foreign policy yet. Oh boy, I hope you're wearing your seatbelts for this next bit. Wait. You weren't for that bit? Why? Okie dokie, now that everybody's hopefully strapped in. In previous videos, I've already said that Egypt up until this point had maintained quite stable relations with neighbouring powers within the Fertile Crescent and the Middle East in the Late Bronze Age world. There existed a locally globalized, I guess you could say, network of trade between all the relevant and key players of the late Bronze Age world of that area. This trade depended quite heavily on regular contact between the heads of state of each of these Bronze Age powers, and also depended on the sending and receiving of lavish diplomatic gifts. But even this under Akhenaten takes quite a hit, and perhaps our biggest key source by far for the reign of Akhenaten, and also for some other pharaohs around his time, comes from that of the Amarna letters. These were stone tablets containing records of correspondence between the Egyptian Empire and various Bronze Age powers, such as those of Mesopotamia, Mitanni, Hatti or the Hittites, and Mycenaean Greece. With his new city of Akhetaten built, it was said that Akhenaten became almost a bit of a recluse during his reign, preferring to spend most of his time presiding at Akhetaten and sticking to his devotion of his chief god Aten religiously, pun intended. But as a result of this, trade and commerce between Egypt and other Bronze Age powers took somewhat of a nosedive, as a result of communication having broken down somewhat between the pharaoh and other great heads of state nearby. One of the documents contained within the Amarna letters even contains a complaint from the then king of Mitanni, Tushratta, who complained about the declining quality of Egypt's diplomatic gifts to the kingdom of Mitanni. For example, he stated how Amenhotep III, Akhenaten's predecessor, had sent him a solid gold statue, whereas the statue he had received from Akhenaten was simply gold-plated. How cheap of Akhenaten. The sudden radio silence from Egypt, however, would serve to be one of the contributing factors in the undoing of the kingdom of Mitanni, with the large and ever-growing shadow of a new threat spreading from Mesopotamia would doom the kingdom of Mitanni. Back in the Egyptian Empire, however, Akhenaten's ignorance of foreign affairs under his reign proved a rather lucrative opportunity for the Hittite Empire, who, due to Akhenaten's neglect of Egypt's allies and diplomatic relations, would begin to encroach on Egypt's northernmost territories and begin its expansion into the regions of Syria and Palestine, areas that so far had been dominated by the Egyptian Empire. Back at home, however, the closure of all of the polytheistic temples and the sudden construction of a brand new capital city for the Egyptian Empire presented new problems of their own for Egypt's interior. For you see, these temple complexes that had sprang up all over the Egyptian Empire as a result of Egypt's polytheistic faith employed hundreds, if not thousands of people, which provided the Egyptian economy with a key staple I might add, that keeps the economies of the world afloat even to this day. That's right, you know it, you hate it, it's one of the certainties in life: income tax. But in all seriousness, with the polytheistic temples that had employed many people within the Egyptian Empire now closed, a key source of revenue was now lost, and with the bill for brand new Akhetaten now weighing heavy on Egypt's economy, all that wealth that had been accumulated over the centuries by previous pharaohs was suddenly beginning to run out. And with seemingly nothing but bad stuff happening during Akhenaten's reign, are there any upsides or developments? Well, in terms of developments, there are. They wouldn't suddenly allow the Egyptian Empire to turn round out of nowhere, re-adopt polytheism and absolutely kick the arse of the Hittite Empire. But despite this, they're still quite significant. Up until this point in ancient Egypt's history, artwork depicting things such as people, pharaohs and gods was quite exaggerated and romanticised by the artists who produced them. Much of the artwork in ancient Egypt up until this point had shown people, gods and beings in the course of doing things such as farming, performing rituals, and even having the odd fight or two. But it's under Akhenaten that we get perhaps one of the first instances of art in still life scenery. One piece of artwork in particular shows Akhenaten alongside his queen Nefertiti spending time with their children. It simply depicted the pharaoh and his family just living as human beings, with Aten depicted above them, showing that they were simply just living their lives under Aten as normal people, you could suggest. This new, and if only short-lived, artistic technique was known as Amarna art and focused quite heavily on the natural depiction of the human body, instead of physical features being either exaggerated or falsified in their representation of human beings. And so therefore we come to the conclusion that Akhenaten's reign was different in almost every aspect of its time, with almost everything changing within ancient Egyptian society, such as religion, foreign policy, governmental and administrative affairs, the economy itself, and even art. And with that we come to the year 1336 BC, with the death of Akhenaten, perhaps the most controversial of all of Egypt's pharaohs, and it appears that Akhenaten's largely unpopular policy of monotheism died out with him, thanks to the reigns of successive pharaohs such as Tutankhamun and Horemheb. But that begs the question, did Akhenaten even have that much of an impact on Egyptian history? Well, after his reign, polytheism made a comeback and things largely went back to the way they were for Egypt. The economy managed to recover, the Egyptians managed to recover some of their lost territories, and Thebes became the capital of the Egyptian Empire once more. As for Akhenaten's legacy, however, some scholars today place Akhenaten as a champion of monotheistic religion within the ancient world. However, if you ask me, even that notion is a bit far-fetched, because polytheism was still widespread and continued to be so until perhaps the reign of the Roman Emperor Theodosius, some 1600 years later. So there you have it, the reign of perhaps the most wacky and controversial pharaoh of ancient Egyptian history, and his supposedly dastardly deeds under his reign, which just go to show that even if something is old and enduring, it can still be in flux. It's not necessarily fixed forever. But the important thing to note here is that a dominant, impressive and complex civilization has stumbled, meaning it's only a matter of time until it falls. I'm Lewis of the Grand Portfolio, and thank you for watching.